Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Project Liberal podcast. My name's Josh Eckel. I'm the president of Project Liberal, and I'm joined today by Max Marty from our steering committee. Thank you for taking the time again, Max.
Greetings, everyone.
Greetings. So today we are going to have a conversation about something that is very pressing in the news. Russian discourse dominating our conversations in the United States. And we're joined today by Pekka Kallioniemi from Vatnik Soup, who is the author of a new book called Vatnik Soup, which is the ultimate guide to Russian disinformation. Pekka, thank you for taking the time to talk to us all the way from I guess, in Kyiv or Finland, wherever you are today. We appreciate the time.
Good to be here. Today I'm in Riga. I'm at this Disinfo 2024 conference, so it's a very timely topic here also.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time talking about this issue within our audience. It's something that our audience cares deeply about, and it's something that many people in the United States are very concerned about, the effort of Russian influence and Russian disinformation in our conversations, in our elections. So I know that you've spent a lot of time in your career doing postdoctoral research on human technology. I know that you have a incredible academic interest in state-of-the-art technologies, and I know most recently over the last couple of years you have spent your time combating directly Russian disinformation in the Western world. So what we wanted to do with this conversation was open it up to talk just broadly about what is disinformation, and then we wanted to go and talk more about how to recognize Russian propaganda, the evolution of it, the aim of it, the scope of it, and really hopefully leave this conversation by giving our audience the tools that they need to really identify it and combat it. So I was going to open up the conversation with you just to ask one really broad question, which is, what is disinformation and how is it maybe different from misinformation?
Okay, so I think these are the terms disinformation and misinformation are often mixed up also in just like traditional media. So disinformation means information that you know to be false and you still decide to spread it. So you know it's bullshit. I can use the word bullshit because it's an academic term now. And you still decide to spread it. Especially like online context today. Misinformation is done. It's not on purpose. So if you spread a false narrative, but you don't know that it's false, then it's in academia it's referred to as misinformation. So that's the kind of distinction between the terms. Then there's also malinformation, which is kind of interesting. It's basically true information that still has kind of malign intent in behind, but I don't really agree with this. But disinformation and misinformation are the main terms used in this context and this research area.
Okay, so is disinformation always bad? I mean, is it like, for example, I'm thinking here of when during COVID. When Fauci was saying the thing about masks, well, they might, they don't work, etc. But he was saying that probably knowing that there was good evidence that they did work, but he was saying it because he was worried that there weren't enough masks. So is disinformation always a negative thing? Should we always think of it that way, or is there useful disinformation?
It depends on who you ask. I personally think that people shouldn't lie, especially, I mean, politicians do it all the time. It's basically their job. But just kidding. But I mean, we had the same situation in Finland with the Finnish former Prime Minister Sanna Marin saying that people shouldn't use masks, for example, because we had massive, we didn't have enough of them. So basically, politicians were kind of, and Fauci was doing this kind of control of information. But I still think that to me, it's bad because it's lying to the general population, and even though the intent can be good. I still don't kind of condone it.
I'm in the same boat. So, I think the real question then would be, maybe broadly before we go into the scope of Russian disinformation, is, when does being disinformed matter? So I ask that question because, we're in the middle of an election. right? And in this moment, being disinformed can obviously have a significant impact on your ability to have a conversation in a democratic system. But can you talk a little bit about how pervasive and how damaging it can be on the negative side?
Sure, yeah. I mean, there are a lot of examples of where disinformation has caused massive harm and negative effects. Like, for example, if you go to Africa, um hundreds of thousands of people have died because of this AIDS-related disinformation. So these campaigns are doing actual harm. And of course, we can also see it in politics, where basically I often call today's political kind of environment this kind of post-truth politics, because basically truth doesn't matter that much anymore. If we look at, for example, Donald Trump, he's basically lying almost all the time. If you look at the fact checking in the debates and so on, so there's so many lies that the fact checkers have hard time keeping up. So I think when there's kind of a malign intent behind disinformation, I think that's when being disinformed is extremely harmful. Like, just a very timely example with the tornado coming, Milton coming to Florida. So there's a lot of disinformation going around this, like, okay, some people are controlling the weather and so on, or it's not going to be. I've even seen a narrative that the whole thing is fake. So imagine living in this area and you actually believe these stories, and you decide, okay, I'm not going to evacuate because this is just just propaganda coming from the opposite side. So of course it can be extremely harmful, and when there's a malign intent behind the information, then it's a bad thing.
Okay, so I live in Tennessee. East Tennessee was devastated by Hurricane Helene. We actually had our governor come out about 3 days ago and say something to the extent of, first of all, he's combating these false narratives, the ones that you were indicating. Hey, FEMA and TEMA are not confiscating people's supplies, and he was kind of going after all these false narratives. One of the things that he said was, I think that a lot of these narratives are being spread by foreign actors. He kind of insinuating that it was Russian foreign influence. So can you talk a bit about, just in the broad strokes, and we get into the specifics, about what Russian disinformation looks like in the broadly, and how people can maybe spot it?
So first of all, I think we have to kind of remember that we usually give too much credit to the Russians. So whenever we see something like a disinformation or like a campaign that's spreading fake news, we always say, okay, it's Russia, it's Russia. Most often it's actually not. Most often there's a lot of like, for example, X / Twitter is dominated by conspiracy theorists, and a lot of their social media engagement comes from coming up with the weirdest stories you can come up with. And most often the origin of these stories are actually, like, Marjorie Taylor Greene is a textbook conspiracy theorist who's spreading theories. She was a supporter of QAnon. She has spread narratives on weather control and so on. So what Russia does really well is they amplify these narratives. So they make these stories seem much bigger. They can spread them far and wide. They can use bot and troll networks to make them appear more popular than they actually are on social media. So they are masters at amplifying stories. But these days, their stories, like their own stories, have quite hard time penetrating the mainstream media, for example, in the West. So they've been really good at that, but the West has kind of catched up on that.
So at the center of it, and this is what I've gathered from reading, is it's more about being, it's basically embracing a post-truth world. It's not necessarily about focusing on any specific narrative in many cases, as much as it's just kind of introducing chaos and confusion, right? Now, in your book, I think you had indicated that there were some narratives specifically related to Russia that you see kind of spread by these actors. Can you speak a little bit more to maybe the narratives that Russia does, specific narratives that Russia does try to push?
So I think they've been extremely good at doing this kind of traditional conservative Russia versus the decadent West. So the decadent West is basically, it's one of their key narratives is always emphasizing how things are going, like, culturally West is in decline. We have a lot of these woke elements and so on, and that they are kind of destroying the Western culture, whereas Russia is trying to keep up to these traditional family values and being going to the church, like religion and so on. They are really good at this, even though it doesn't, when you start observing like what's happening in Russia, it doesn't really apply, because they are a very secular country, and there's a lot of problems, of course, in Russia too. So it's a myth that's actually working really well in the West. Of course, they also have a lot of narratives that work mostly in their own media landscape. So they usually talk about like the World War II. They talk about the Great Patriotic War when they fought the Nazis, even though they were initially allied with the Nazis, but they incidentally forget that part. But I mean, they kind of have their own version of what happened during World War II, and that's what they always usually refer to still, and it's brought up when they talk about, for example, the war in Ukraine. So they kind of connect these two. So when you hear the stories about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, it's basically Russia is saying that this is just the continuation of the Great Patriotic War. This time we only fight the Nazis in Ukraine rather than Nazis in Germany. So it works really well in their local media space, but it doesn't really. It used to work quite well also in the West. So there were a lot of people who were saying that their neo-Nazis are in power in Ukraine, but I think this power has diminished over time. But they have their own narrative for the local media space, but also like for the Western audiences.
And Pekka, when you say Russia disseminates this kind of narrative, this sort of disinformation, who do you mean by Russia? Do you mean, is this like a state-sponsored? You know, is it coming down from Putin hands it to Russian intelligence, that then disseminates it through some sort of propaganda arm, or is it more diffuse than that, right? So it seems to me like the most useful way to disseminate disinformation is to get other people to do your dirty work for you, right? So just put out a narrative, get people within your sphere to believe it, and then they push out, they continue to amplify the message, etc., on your behalf rather than doing it directly. But who is it that's doing the actual? Who is the they in Russia of which you speak?
Okay, I'm gonna give you an example. Let's go back in time to 2012. Everybody knows Yevgeny Prigozhin, who started the PMC Wagner, but he also started the Internet Research Agency, which was basically kind of a prototype or the first version of troll farms. This was back in 2012, 2013. So what they did, they turned propaganda and online disinformation into factory work. They hired people, students, journalists, and so on, to work in shifts and produce anti-Western, pro-Kremlin messages online around the clock. And some journalists, including a Finnish journalist called Jessica Aro, found out about this around 2013. She wrote a book about it. It's a very good book. And then basically it expanded from there. At this point, it was very much a Kremlin-connected enterprise, but soon people or entrepreneurial people around the world realized that this is a good business. You can make a lot of good money on propaganda, disinformation, and you started having a lot of these troll farms being formed in Israel, in Philippines, in Africa, South America, and then you could basically buy it as a service. And this is basically how it works today. Is you outsource it. So a lot of the main narratives are being probably spun in this Kremlin like FSB, GRU, but then they are being outsourced to troll farms that operate in Ghana, Nigeria, Philippines. So it has become Israel. It has become this big business, and it's a very lucrative business. But I mean, of course, they also still have a domestic troll farms, but it's an automated troll farms and bot farms. But now it's very much an international thing, and you can buy these as a service. And I mean, social media manipulation is included in this. So you can buy likes, you can buy shares, you can buy comments online. It's very easy. Just Google it, and you can find a lot of services that provide these things.
And is this something that other countries that like to disseminate disinformation also do? Like, how do other countries such as Iran or China, other countries that are known to put out disinformation in this way, how do they operate differently than does Russia?
Okay, every country has a bit of a different approach. If you look at, I usually talk about CCP because it's I kind of want to make a distinction between the Communist Party and China as a country.
Yeah.
But the CCP operates a bit differently. Initially, they were the Chinese. The classical Chinese approach is that they praise China. China is the best country in the world. They do the best. They are best at everything, and they do this a lot with sports and culture and so on. Just praising the Chinese culture and the achievements of the Chinese Communist Party. But recently, in recent years, they have also started kind of defaming other countries. So this is a very classic Russian strategy is to, okay, because you cannot say that many good things about Russia, we'll just talk shit about other countries in the West. And China has kind of adopted this strategy too. Iran has very much been in this sphere from very similar than Russia in the beginning. Maybe they are a bit behind. And then there are countries who try to kind of control the information space. So whenever there is criticism towards, for example, the regime in power, you will use these troll farms to kind of quiet down or silence these. Like Saudi Arabia is a good example of this. So they use these kind of troll armies to silence the dissidents and so on.
And how have the tactics evolved since the old Soviet days? I mean, we know Putin, for example, was trained in the KGB, and so he was trained in the old approach to propaganda. But how have the narratives, in particular, obviously the specific tactics, troll farms and all that are all new, but how have the narratives changed since prior to '91, or have they not changed very much? It's just that the way that they're implemented is quite different.
Exactly, they haven't changed that much. The medium has changed, the scale has changed, but the narratives are very much the same. So one of the big umbrella conspiracy theories that is being spread aggressively today is the deep state or the global elite trying to take over the world. Like maybe you've heard of the Great Reset conspiracy theory. And a lot of this comes from a very old fabricated text called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it's from 1903, which basically it describes a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world and kind of enslave people. So a lot of these narratives, they are just being kind of recycled from old stories. And of course, the neo-Nazis, and this comes from World War II, bioweapons labs. That was kind of the story right around the beginning of the full-scale invasion. It came from Bulgarian, Romanian information sphere from around 2014. So a lot of these are just being recycled, like maybe repackaged a little bit and then recycled. And all these corruption stories, they've been used since forever. Like right now, Russia's main effort is to show Ukraine and its leaders as corrupt, that they are spending money on villas and yachts and what, I don't know, like cars and whatever. There's just like they're spending money that US is sending, for example, to as aid, which it's of course ridiculous, but basically the same stories but different medium.
And there is one narrative that seems new or different to me. In the old days, no, I don't. I was born at the tail end of the Soviet days, but I don't have any recollection of what the propaganda was going around during that time. But I believe that the Soviet Union was selling its communism as the answer to religion, and that they still saw themselves as a very atheist movement. But now Russia sees itself as, it seems to me, as the vanguard of tradition and religion and family. This is the narrative that I hear them putting out, against the woke, decadent, liberal West. So is that a new narrative, right? That seems new to me. It seems like it would be new. or is it not? I mean, is that something that somehow was an aspect of the old Soviet days as well?
Um, That's actually a good question. So I think in many ways we can see similarities in Soviet Union promoting communism as an ideology or Orthodox Christianity as a religion. I mean, that it's just kind of a vessel of information and disinformation that you can kind of spread through. So if you look at the Orthodox Church of Russia, it has always been infiltrated by spies, KGB spies, FSB spies. If you like Patriarch Kirill, who is in charge of the Orthodox Church in Russia, used to be KGB spy. And I mean, once you become a spy, you don't really ever stop. So basically, it's just it's an instrument of spreading propaganda, state propaganda. That's how I see the role of the Orthodox Church in Russia. It's mainly used as a propaganda weapon to promote the war and promote the Kremlin leadership and kind of praise them at the same time. And I think Kirill is an old KGB agent in charge of this church is a good example how kind of cynical the whole system is in that sense. But in the old days, it was basically praising of communism. They were trying to spread it to different countries, Cambodia, Cuba, and so on. So I really don't, or Afghanistan is probably a good example. So it's just, I see it's just a other side of the same coin. That's how I basically see it.
So I want to zoom back out a little bit to talk about the ultimate aim of this, especially as it might relate to the United States. But one of the things that you mentioned in your book I thought was an interesting anecdote, so I want to tee it up here as well. So obviously we talked about this. It seems to me like the goal of Russian propaganda is to cause just massive distrust, is kind of a breakdown of the ability for us to collectively come to some sort of truthful consensus on what the facts are. And obviously for democratic systems, that's incredibly destructive, right? If I can't call a friend of mine and have a conversation about what truth is, then we have a very difficult time as a democracy coming to consensus on what things should be done to address the challenges that we face. So one of the things you mentioned related to the misinformation and how it causes harm was actually an anecdote I think that you had brought up from Russia. So you talked about how in Russia there was all this distrust around institutions and kind of the establishment that spread COVID misinformation and distrust of just kind of the established medical order. They were saying that COVID was very deadly and that you need to be concerned about it. And it backfired on Russia because once they came out with a vaccine, there was all this distrust, and the vaccine Sputnik was not taken by people in Russia. And I think you mentioned that the Russian-speaking population of Lithuania was like exponentially like ridiculously harmed by COVID. So I'm curious as to like how you could talk about how this might backfire, and just a little bit more on like just this strategy in general and how it materializes in real life.
I mean, of course, the style of Russian propaganda is often referred to as Firehose or falsehood. It's this high volume approach where quantity matters more than quality. It's like, okay, you just spread a lot of contradicting narratives and you do it en masse, so you actually like fill the whole social media space with these false narratives, contradicting narratives, and it creates this very confusing situation where people don't really trust anything anymore, which is, of course, this was the reality in the Soviet system, and it's been reality for many Soviets and Russians for a long time. So, of course, it can also affect and harm the Russian society. So basically, as we are kind of reaching this post-truth era where the truth doesn't matter anymore that much. It's more about the emotions that the message kind of invokes in people. So I think again, Trump is a perfect embodiment of this. So it's like even if you fact check him all the time, it doesn't really matter because the people care more about how Trump makes them feel. And this is of course this is very dangerous because if you have an actual very I don't know, dangerous situation, like a domestic situation, then it's very difficult to inform people because we've reached this kind of low trust environment. So people don't trust journalists, people don't trust politicians, people don't trust authorities. So when people in a country would have to kind of collaborate or coordinate together, it's very difficult because there is no trust in any of the institutions. So I think this is extremely dangerous to a country, and I think the United States with this kind of two-party system is extremely vulnerable to this kind of division that we can see in the country already. I think one example that I often bring up is the delay of Ukraine military aid. It lasted like 6 months because of the parties were just basically arguing with each other, and Russia was really throwing gas into these flames and kind of just amplifying these narratives, and it made it seem much bigger than it actually was. So I think it's a good example of if like widespread disinformation can make country extremely dysfunctional.
So I'm curious about this. I find it strange. Putting myself in the seat of the Chinese Communist Party, if my message is that China is great and the things it does are wonderful and it doesn't have a lot of problems, it seems like it's generally good. It's going to help Chinese foreign policy. It's going to help China's goals geopolitically. But okay, so that makes sense to me. But Russia putting out the message that, or just creating chaos, right? Trying to create chaos politically within their adversaries seems like a dangerous strategy because it's harder to understand how that's going to turn out. It's harder to know where it's going to go. I mean, for example, I think people believe that they have a clear idea of what Trump is going to do vis-a-vis Ukraine or such. But that's crazy. I mean, Trump can do all kinds of things, right? So, and the more that you sow discord within a country, the less that its outcomes can be predicted, and you can try to manipulate where it's going to go. So, how is it in Russia's interests to just create discord and havoc rather than merely get people to think better of Russia?
I think the idea there is that when a country is divided, when the country's population is polarized, they are more focused on domestic issues, more focused on infighting, which makes their foreign policy much weaker. So we kind of saw this with the argument between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Republicans wanted to tie the Ukraine aid to the border security, and when there was kind of the Democrats then made a package on this, they still kind of ignored it. So the foreign policy becomes extremely weak when two parties are basically just focused on fighting each other. And I don't think Russia really cares of course they care who becomes the president, but in the end, even after the elections, the US will be extremely divided society, and there will be a lot of infighting because of the two-party system and because of kind of you can correct me if you disagree, but this kind of low level of media literacy and critical thinking and kind of looking for the truth. There is not, in that sense, I see you as, I really like the idea of a free speech, that you already had the level of free speech in the US, but also I think it should be combined with the good high level of media literacy and critical thinking, and I don't think that's there in the US right now.
Unfortunately.
I could not agree more with you. I live that every day and see those kind of things, sent by family members and people that I know and friends of mine. It is making an impact. So let's maybe then talk about the impact specifically and the way this is materializing, because you had mentioned the two-party system and some of the chaos that's happening there. So obviously you've heard of the tenant indictment, I'm sure, of all of the DOJ indicting this Lauren Chen from the United States for basically taking money from Russian nationals and Russian agents to spread narratives within the United States. The indictment had mentioned that this was at least alluded to the fact that this was very wide-reaching. Like there are much more organizations or individuals that are tied up in this. So do you have any just broad insights on this specific indictment, or just at least the scope of how this operation is functioning? Because I mean, it seems pretty clear to me after reading that indictment. I mean, I think I posted about this. The stuff I'm seeing coming out from Tim Pool, for example, who's this massive influencer, is almost identical to what I'm seeing on Russian state TV. Like the narratives are one-to-one. So do you have any commentary just on that broad indictment and maybe the scope of those efforts specifically in the United States?
Yeah, so I mean, $10 million, that's a relatively high amount of money being funneled from RT, Russian state-funded media, to American YouTubers. But I still I think it's still just the tip of the iceberg. I think there are a lot of these operations that we are not aware of. Not sure if, for example, the FBI is, but I still feel like we don't really get the big picture yet. Because if we look at the election interference that happened in 2016 with the U.S. presidential election, and also the Brexit referendum, it took organizations many years to actually kind of discover the scale of it. So I think what we saw recently is just tip of the iceberg. I think there's a lot more money because we have a lot of instruments that can be used to kind of hide the source, like cryptocurrencies and so on, and also like shell companies in countries like Turkey, Czech Republic, and so on. So it's still very tiny part of the whole operation, and most people are saying that, okay, what did they get with these $10 million? You get videos that have 10,000 views, but that's basically what Russia does. They throw a lot of money at these operations, and sometimes they bear fruit, but most often they do not. So what we saw, I mean, it was a big operation, but what was the actual impact? I think this is what people often ask. But I think even if these operations change the minds of, let's say, 100 people in a swing state, let's say Pennsylvania, and I think that's already quite big effect on the U.S. elections, for example. So
yeah,
when we combine a lot of these operations, you can actually maybe see even if the effect is incremental in one project, then if you have hundreds of these, the effect is actually quite large.
Okay. So I want to hand it to Max here in a second, but I got one more question on that topic. So the one thing that's been difficult for me to understand, and we have a running joke in some of the groups that I talk about the difference between maybe a willing and an unwilling asset in the spread of Russian propaganda. It seems to me like some of these people, for example, I couldn't imagine that somebody like Tim Pool, after seeing the content that he's putting out and just looking at how similar it is to RT, could not understand that he was caught up in a scheme like this. But I've also worked within the libertarian movement for a long time, and I've seen people spreading these narratives, and I know for a fact these people aren't getting paid. I'm curious as to kind of how you differentiate, or how you know, can we differentiate between willing and unwilling assets? How should we approach that kind of, like, how do we know, is there any way to kind of to maybe identify that or address that?
Oh my God! If there was, the whole system would fall down. But I think it's still very difficult to distinguish between useful idiots and paid assets.
Yeah.
And that's basically the biggest problem, is because many of these people are genuine. They genuinely think that there are global elites, the deep state, that is trying to take over the world and enslave people, and you will own nothing and you'll be happy. All these phrases that they always kind of state. So this is it's a very genius system in a way that it combines paid assets who understand what they are doing with useful idiots who don't. So kind of this it makes an interesting soup of people where these people agree with each other, but some of them only agree because of the money that they are being paid. But yeah, so in the book I borrowed or stole this system from counterintelligence, this acronym MICE. So what motivates these people? So money, ideology, compromising material and ego, basically. And and of course it could be a combination of the two. So for example, Douglas McGregor, probably his ego was extremely bruised after he was kind of declined in the U.S. Army, or I'm not sure if he was in the U.S. Army or Navy, but either way, then probably the money he got from RT when he did work for them helped to kind of to choose this career path that he's now taken as a very in my view, very anti-American person.
It seems like the best of those to find and to go for is ideology, because of course money it could be found out, and then if money gets traced and then that gets revealed, then it discredits your asset, and now the asset, like Tim Pool, is no longer going to be taken near, I hope nearly as seriously when it comes to anything he says about Ukraine and Russia. And I caught myself as I was saying that, but I would imagine that convincing people to do it for you for free is the best strategy of all. But are there any other interesting high profile assets that other than Tim Pool that you think are worth bringing up as illustrative of what we're describing?
I think a lot of people disagree with this, but I think Elon Musk and Donald Trump are helping the Kremlin in many ways with what they do and what they say. So if you look at what for example Elon Musk has tweeted throughout the conflict, I mean what he did at the beginning of the full-scale war, giving up Starlink, that was incredible. That's probably one of the most important asset that Ukraine has received, like in addition to the military aid. But also we see this kind of him slowly shifting towards these strange, very pro-Kremlin narratives. Like he tweeted about Ruchev's mistake, which is something that only Russians speak about. There is absolutely nobody in the American language that basically uses that, like outside of Russian media space. So these are very interesting kind of phrases that he's used, and a lot of the stuff seems to be coming from his old friend from the PayPal mafia, David Sachs. So David Sachs came up with this peace negotiation proposal, and Elon Musk basically shared it on X and so on. But like if you look at over time, Elon's been sharing memes, anti-Ukraine memes made by a Russian social media company. So this is like his kind of involvement in this, what I see as anti-Ukraine and pro-Kremlin propaganda is actually, it's quite remarkable. And I still feel like a lot of the stuff, the meeting with Putin, Donald Trump did in Helsinki, I think it was 2019.
Yeah.
And like his businesses starting already in the 80s in Russia, I think they are still a bit kind of interesting, at least shady on many levels. But like I don't know if you read about this Bob Woodward's new book.
Yeah, I
called
did.
War. Like they even after leaving the White House, Trump had multiple calls with Putin and even sent him these COVID tests when they were in shortage. So they are still evidently communicating, which it's interesting to me because it's still very covert thing, and we don't really know much about that.
Yeah, and you add to the fact that he had taken, at least this morning I saw specifically, British military secrets to Mar-a-Lago after he had left office, and then you add that to the fact that he's got a personal relationship with Putin. Yeah, it's absolutely horrifying. Max, where were you going with that?
I was just going to say regarding Elon Musk, I'm still hopeful because I think there's a lot of good he can still do, and a lot of good he has done with as many companies as he's created and as many new technologies as he's pushed forth. I hope I'm still on the camp of hoping that Elon Musk gets out of politics in the coming after the election and goes back to doing what really creates value and pushes progress forward in the world, which are all the things he's doing with SpaceX and Tesla and
Let's go.
Neuralink and all the other company. Yeah, he has so much potential that he's squandering and turning around with this work. I hope that changes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Pekka, I want to talk a bit before we run out of time, a bit about just how this propaganda manifests elsewhere. So there's obviously a specific strategy in the United States, but as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is obviously spread across the world, Africa, and across Europe, etc. So can we talk just briefly before about how Russian propaganda manifests in other regions outside of the United States?
Definitely. I mean, their main focus right now is outside of the Western countries like Europe and US and Canada. So the so-called global South. So if you go to Africa, in many countries, Sputnik is the most popular media on radio or on TV. In many, like for example, in Mali, where Wagner is also operating. Also, the infrastructure there is mostly built by the Chinese, so Huawei and so on. So these kind of satellites and so on, TV networks and radio networks, they are operated by the Chinese, and a lot of the content is actually coming from the Russians. So Sputnik is huge in Africa, and they promote and produce a lot of anti-Western material, and it's actually working really well because of the colonial past of many countries like Belgium and France and so on. So they kind of have a good reason to be very skeptical of European countries. So yeah, there are massive operations there, and many countries they do a lot of hybrid operations, which is basically combining real world things with online campaigns. One of them, I think this was in Mali, is one of the biggest beer producers was a French beer producer. So Wagner kind of made an operation against this factory. They destroyed everything, and then they came up with the Russian alternative. So they brought in a Russian beer and promoted. They made a lot of viral campaigns around it, and now it's the most popular beer in. So it's kind of this soft power combined with kinetic operations, and these are very, very effective because, okay, what is the most popular beer in Mali is the Russian beer, and that's actually a big thing. So they are doing a lot of these interesting things and malign things in Africa. And then if you go to South America, RT is huge in South America. So were you saying something?
No, go for it.
No. Okay. So RT is huge in South America and, for example, in Brazil. So they are in many ways they are controlling the media space in the global South, and this is basically where we have in the West it's our blind spot. So we don't really kind of recognize the scale of how they operate in these regions.
And you're talking, Pekka, a lot about Russian influence. At first, we were talking about Russian influence here in the U.S. and then in other countries, like you said, South America, etc., other continents. What about within Russia itself? How much do common Russians living outside the main cities, living in some province in Siberia, how much do they actually believe these narratives or buy into these narratives versus Russian elites living in Moscow? What is the, do these people actually believe it? Do they know it's all a bunch of lies and they just live under it? They don't say much because it's dangerous to say something. What is your assessment there?
My assessment is that those people who lived through the Soviet times, they don't believe much in anything. Like whatever the Kremlin puts out, a lot of people don't believe it because, well, they lived through the Soviet times and it turned out to be a big lie. But I mean, what Russia is doing right now, they have become this kind of what's the word? So they are focusing heavily on the war industry. So they are a country that puts a lot of money into anything related to the war. So basically, education system is fully used to spread propaganda. So if you start early, like media literacy, but in a bad way, basically saying that Russia is the greatest country in the world and the West is the enemy. So they start this in schools now. They even teach kids to shoot and like say war is a good thing and so on. So basically they've started this extremely extensive brainwashing operation, and of course if you start it early enough, it will eventually bear fruit. So they will have this young population that is extremely hostile towards the West and kind of promote the war and so on. We see these examples, like if you go to China, they've used it extensively also, and of course the Soviet times. But basically they are transforming the whole Russian system into this kind of pro-war society.
So you would say the propaganda is working. It's not the people aren't just pretending to believe in this stuff, but it's actually getting in there.
Yes. So I'll give you an example. During the 80s, there was a KGB agent who defected to Canada, called Yuri Bezmenov, and you can still find the interview on YouTube. In this interview, he says that all these information and influence operations, they are not short-term things. They take time. They take 15, 25 years. So that's what Russia is doing now. They're looking into the future, basically transforming the whole society to be more pro-war and so on. So they are kind of thinking it long-term. Whereas in many cases in the West, we are thinking short-term. We are thinking the next elections and so on. In Russia, in the Kremlin, they don't really have to think about this because they are in this extremely authoritarian system. It's the same in China. So you can basically plan all these propaganda efforts long-term when they are actually effective. Then it becomes brainwashing. Whereas like short-term information operations or online operations, they hardly ever change anyone's mind. So people don't just magically start thinking that Russia is actually pretty cool. That's not how it works. So in short term, the idea is to polarize populations in the West, but in the long term, the propaganda efforts will try to change the whole society within Russia.
Oh, Lord, yeah. See, I'm concerned about the same thing happening in the United States, which I've been seeing these narratives get more and more effective. So but to take us out, since we're almost to the hour, we want to zoom out and talk a little bit about big picture. So we touched on this earlier, but I want to come back to it. Do you think the West is doing enough to combat this? If so, what do you think could be done to counter the threats?
No, basically, we're not doing much. I think Europe is kind of trying to do something through regulation, but I don't actually believe in regulation. I think it can be a short-term solution, but not really a long-term solution. I think there's also this saying that the US innovates and the EU regulates. But I don't believe in this kind of regulation. I think what we have done in Finland is actually pretty amazing. So integrating all this media literacy and critical thinking into the education system. So already in Finland, already in preschool, we start talking about the consequences of lying, how they can affect friendships and so on, and then it kind of goes from there throughout the whole education system. So it's something that's constantly being discussed, and it also includes new media formats like I don't know, TikTok is probably one of the most popular social media platforms in Finland. So it's kind of integrate all these new innovations are also included in this discussion. So I think that's a good approach. The problem with this approach is that politicians are not ready to talk about it because it takes time and it takes money. And it takes a long time, like in Russia, the propaganda that they're pushing, it takes time to see the effects. Because in many countries, European countries, we kind of go through the election cycles. So it's kind of, there's not that much long-term thinking, looking into the future. But I think this is the way to go. We have to create this idea of cognitive resilience, cognitive defense that has to be built against the Russian bullshit, the Chinese bullshit, the American bullshit, wherever it's coming from. We have to understand that this may not be true. We have to promote the idea of critical thinking and media literacy.
Briefly on that point, and I try, one of the things that we try with Project Liberal, and I think Max and I try all the time, is try to put forward a hopeful and optimistic view of the world, right? But I'm going to get a little doomer for a second and just briefly ask you a bit of that specific. So with the advent of AI, and I know you've spent a lot of time researching advanced technologies and things of this nature, I'm deeply concerned because you mentioned in the United States, there's already this problem with economic literacy. I think it's a very big issue with older generations that find themselves much more susceptible to this. But with the advent of artificial intelligence, I mean, we're seeing the ability right now to create photorealistic video with a text prompt. Some of these things I can identify, but I have a very big concern that in about a year I'm probably not going to be able to identify them, right? Like even me and somebody who spends as much time as I do looking at this. Do you have any just commentary on that specific element of the threat? Because I think that the first thing that's going to happen, we're already kind of seeing this with Elon Musk spreading AI photos and things like that, and kind of taking his AI photo generator and taking all the restrictions off of it so you could generate photos of anything. Can you maybe think about like the role AI might play in this? And is there anything beyond media literacy that should be done on that front?
I think it's still a big unknown. AI. Okay, so I'm at this disinformation conference right now, and there are two topics that are being discussed. It's AI and I forgot the other one. But well, AI is at the center of the whole thing. It's basically just like how can we what can we do about AI? And I think right now what we can do is observe. We have to see like you said, 1 year in AI development is a really long. A lot can happen, and this like we see these extremely big technological leaps. Like in 1 month, span of 1 month, we can see some amazing things. But I mean, I think it will reinforce this idea of post-truth era where people will start doubting everything. It's going to be very confusing times because even when you see something that's real, people will just say that it's AI if it doesn't fit their worldview. If it doesn't fit into their agenda, they will say this is AI. And then people will of course fall for these AI videos that will seem extremely realistic. So I really don't have an answer to that. It's a very active topic also in academia, but probably in policy too. Like how should we approach this? There have been some suggestions that all AI content should have blockchain kind of identification, that it's actually AI and so on. But who regulates this? Who is involved? Is for example, is China and Russia are they going to be involved in this kind of initiative? Probably not. So I honestly don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, see, there is no there is no clear solution to this problem. I think that's one of the reasons why we've talked about it so much, in both internally and with some of our guests. We just had a guest on last week that we talked about this for a long period of time. I think to your point, the one thing we can do is media literacy, but this is a completely uncharted territory for humanity. This is not some sort of a niche issue. This is something that's going to fundamentally change the nature that we interact, the nature of the way that we interact with truth. So no clear answer, but we're going to keep trying to find it.
I have a suggestion. I mean, I think what I try to, the people I try to surround myself with are people who are interested ultimately in truth, in what is true, in what is factually happened, and that's not an easy thing to attain. That's not an easy thing to figure out, and a lot of times you have to triangulate in on what is true. So you have a video. Well, what other sources that you trust are corroborating that this video is accurate and not just AI? Or how likely does it seem like a video that is being produced in this way, looks this way, is or isn't being faked? Or is there some other trick being played? And I think just being interested in that, just not so instead of immediately saying, oh, this is a video that confirms my worldview or disconfirms it, so I'm not going to believe it. Instead saying, taking pleasure in the idea that whatever you believe or whatever you think is what is actually the fact, rather than just what you want to be the case. I think that's very important, and that would be my response to this.
There's also one more thing that we've talked about, and I think it was Destiny that we talked about this with when we were on his show, was, you could leverage AI as a tool to identify false AI information. So I mean, you could use that weapon as a tool to say create community notes or maybe assess videos. So I mean, I think there's some novel approaches, but
My understanding is that's kind of a losing battle, though. Like you're always one
Yeah.
step behind, the newest systems and the newest approach, and so there might be some benefit to that, but I think it's tricky as well. I wanted to get back to one thing you were talking about, Pekka, in Finland. You were talking about one solution being to improve the education system, to make young kids grow up understanding that just because you see something in a video or in a particular source on the internet or such doesn't mean that you should take it at face value. And there are all these narratives, and here's how propaganda works, etc. But that's much more difficult to do in the U.S., right? And Finland is a much more homogeneous country. It's a lot smaller. The U.S. is a very large, very diverse area. Education systems are managed by states and localities, and it's very difficult to imagine creating that kind of environment here in the U.S., which I think I think like you're saying, there's so many more people being exposed to a fire hose of information, whether it's on TikTok or Twitter. A lot more people trying to kind of be engaged in the big discussions, having an opinion on Ukraine, having an opinion on all these other political matters. And that's very hard, right? It's very hard to, within such a landscape, to actually understand what is or isn't true, who is or isn't right, to what extent, what is the likelihood that this is happening versus that's happening. To me, that's a lot to put on people. And I think in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong, or you think I'm wrong, but we didn't expect average everyday people to have opinions on what's going on in foreign policy in Russia or in other parts of the world. It's just a lot for people to have to deal with. So maybe one other solution in my mind is simply to be okay with people not having opinions on these things, to try and not expect that everybody should be fully informed on these subjects, and should instead be able to say, look, I don't have a strong opinion on that. I'm not going to vote on that. I'm not going to disseminate my views on that sort of thing. So I also find this from a very personal perspective. In my family, I have family members who, I walk into their house, and the first thing I do is turn off their cable TV, because I just know they don't. They grew up in a different world, highly educated, very intelligent people, but they grew up in a different world. This is not. I cannot expect of them to have all the tools necessary to now be able to decipher all the things that we're talking about. So maybe that's what I'm saying. Do you have maybe my view is a little more elitist, you can call it that, but I think the average person should just stop trying to have deep, careful opinions on these things, because it's just very difficult unless you spend a lot of time in it from a very critically evaluating perspective. It's very difficult to have accurate opinions on what's going on.
I agree 100%. And I don't think that's elitist. I think it's just, I think, okay, let's take an example. How closely have you followed the civil war in Sudan? Or how closely did you follow the war in Syria, for example? There
a little
are
more.
a lot of there are a lot of conflicts around the world, and most people don't give a shit. Just to put it bluntly, our cognitive abilities are limited, and many people would rather think about day-to-day stuff and actually positive stuff instead of war and suffering and so on. I'm an activist. That's why I'm so heavily involved in this kind of Ukraine information space, and I'm also a researcher. So that's also another reason why I'm extremely biased, in the sense that I'm pro-Ukraine. I'm not afraid to say it. It makes me biased, but I still try to kind of stick to the truth and find the truth. Because I value the truth highly, but not everybody should be involved in all this, in these discussions. And they don't have to be. I know a lot of people who don't really want to even talk about this. And once, like, it's been what, 900 days of war now in Ukraine, more and more people, as time goes by, more and more people care less and less about Ukraine. That's the reality of it. And the further the conflict, less people care. So, I mean, like if we look at the Hamas terrorist attack on 7th of October, exactly a year ago, a lot of people have already kind of moved on from there, and it's perfectly fine. People shouldn't worry too much about all the horrible things happening in the world, and they don't have to.
Yeah, my concern is that the genie's out of the bottle with social media. It's almost like this is the world that we live in now. I couldn't agree more, though. I think that there needs to be more of this kind of humble approach. If you don't know the answer to a question, you don't need to be forced to answer and go on the record. To take us out, Max, you want to ask maybe one more final question, and then we close out and talk about the book?
Yeah. What you do, Pekka, is important work, but it's also, to my mind, dangerous work. Right? You're exposing individuals and seeing connections between them and what's happening in the Kremlin. So, do you worry on a personal level that do you stay away from windows in tall buildings, and do you worry about what you're having in your coffee when it's poured at a restaurant? I mean, on a personal level, what do you worry about?
I don't really worry about those things that much. I think this is the 13th floor or something. So if you see an FSB agent coming in, you know what happened. I still drink tea. I still feel like I'm like a small fish in all this, even though it's all the work has an impact. But I still think the work is relatively safe. Of course, I've taken precautions. I'm in constant communication with people who can help me and so on. But I think I don't want to give into the fear. If I give into the fear, it will affect my work. I write something, I start thinking, can I say this? Should I say this? I don't want to give into the fear, but I will prepare for whatever might happen. But I mean, I think this is just another thing where we give too much power to the Kremlin or the Russian system. Is like, okay, they have tentacles everywhere and they can assassinate anybody everywhere. I think this is false. So I don't want to worry too much. I don't want to give into the fear, but it's a dangerous job. But somebody's got to do it.
Massive amount of respect for the work that you do, Pekka. Like, genuinely, it's much needed in the United States right now, and it is incredibly valuable. So to take us out, obviously we recommend the audience pick up your new book, Vadnik Soup: Ultimate Guide to Russian Disinformation. You can find that on Amazon. Do you have any other things you'd like to plug to our audience if they want to, say, learn more about this or dig into the facts, or maybe find more about you and your work?
Not really. I'm happy that the book is out now. So, and I actually enjoyed reading the book. When I was writing it, I was thinking like, this is going to be shit, but it's actually pretty good. We have the audiobook version coming out soon. It's also good because it's more like a story that is being told. It's a little different from the actual physical book. But I'm gonna continue publishing Vatnik Soups on Russian information operations and influence operations and the pro-Kremlin propagandists, because they are an endless supply. There's infinite amount of these people, useful idiots and paid assets, and I will keep on kind of raising awareness around this issue.
Well, thank you again for your time. Greatly appreciate it. Keep up the good work, and stay away from the 13-story windows. But
Yeah.
At vadniksoup.com, you could read more about the work that he's doing. So to our audience, I wanted to say thank you guys for listening. If you want to learn more about Project Liberal, we are a cross-partisan coalition of individuals committed to a free and open society, and we're fighting the authoritarian forces in the United States and around the world that are trying to undermine those values. You can join our project at projectliberal.org, get on our mailing list, or become a member at projectliberal.org/member. We greatly appreciate your time. Pekka and Max, thank you again.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful
Thank you.
day. See you guys.
You too.
See ya.